Yes, we must remember that when we look at the geography of South Africa, we have a country called Lesotho right in the middle of South Africa, bordering on the Free State today, what was originally the Orange Free State, and this is what we call a group of people who speak Sotho. So whether they were from Lesotho or whether they were from South Africa, essentially they were from the same grouping of people. But the South African tourists of 1899, there were a number of Basotas in the side, but there were a number of other players who made up of different ethnic groups, and that's why I think we can refer to these as South Africans more generally rather than only Basotho tourists. What we have from the evidence, we have an Arthur Williams who was a Welshman who had a good friend of his, Robert Day, who was out in the Orange Free State Republic. He was a miner, Robert Day, and what he was doing, he was prospecting for diamonds in Jagersfontein. Jagersfontein, a diamond mining town 100 miles south of Bloemfontein. Arthur Williams discussed the possibility of bringing over a group of South Africans, and Robert went about bringing together a black South African football team to tour Britain. This, of course, was very unique because at that stage no South African side had toured Britain, and these were groundbreakers who went over and represented South Africa. They played under the auspices of the Orange Free State Football Association, affiliated to the South African Football Association. By the time that the South African tourists were in Britain, the South African Football Association got to hear about this tour, and they were very unhappy that a group of black South Africans was representing South Africa in Britain, because they wanted to send the first white football team. The first white football team from South Africa was only sent to Britain in 1924. So again, these South Africans, these black South Africans, were groundbreakers. I think there are various ways of looking at the purpose of the 1899 tour. Joseph Twayi, the captain of the team, was 27 when he went over to tour Britain, and he, in a number of newspaper interviews, said that he'd only learned to play football in his early 20s. So that, by suggestion, means that he wasn't necessarily a very accomplished player. He probably had the rudimentary or the basic skills, but was by no means the equivalent of the professional players and professional teams the South Africans played against in Britain. In the British press, it was reported that the South Africans had been sent to Britain to learn the game, although they were learning against the top opposition of the day. So one way of looking is that they were sent over to learn, but the other way possibly is they were sent over as a bit of an exhibition of Africans playing football, and not playing football particularly well. During the late 19th century, we had a number of incidents of overt racism, where we had, for example, just before the South African tour took place, we had what was known as the Savage South Africa exhibition, which was a group of South Africans who were exhibited at Earl's Court in London, where we had South Africans dressed in traditional clothing, with a kraal that had been set up where people paying visitors would pay to view these South Africans. So it's similar in a way to going to a zoo, people on display. So the other way of looking at it is that possibly the South Africans were there as an exotic exhibition of footballers. The football in South Africa, as I originally said, was institutionalized in the 1890s. South Africa was one of the first members of FIFA, became a member of FIFA in 1910. But we must remember that South African football had always been segregated along racial lines, and only in the 1930s did we have African football associations being established for African footballers. There had been African football teams for as long as there had been white football teams. We must also remember that when the South African tourists came over in 1899, they landed a month before the South African War broke out between the Transvaal Republic, also known as the South African Republic, and the Orange Free State Republic, and Britain. So when the South Africans were playing in a number of locations around Britain, Joseph Twayi was interviewed and asked, well, what did he think about the war? And Joseph Twayi came out strongly in support of Britain. He declared his loyalty for Queen Victoria, and he said that if we are expected to fight, we will fight against the Boers, against the white settlers, years in the Transvaal and in the Orange Free State for Britain. And we must remember that Joseph was from Bloemfontein. There was even suggestions in the local press that he should be interned as an enemy, when in fact he was coming out strongly in support of Britain. Joseph Twayi returned with his team in January 1900, and Joseph Twayi was very involved in local politics, and I think it was a result of his tour to Britain, where he was treated as an equal. He was given the platform to speak to British people. He was given the platform to be treated as an equal, and he returned to South Africa expecting the same. Britain had won the South African War, and he expected the same treatment to be given to him as a black South African. As we know, that was not the case. And Joseph Twayi was actually one of the founding members of what became the African National Congress, the ANC, which was established in 1912. Joseph was actually the treasurer of the African National Congress in 1915. So I think there's a direct political link between the tour of 1899 and the formation of what became the African National Congress in 1912. The South African tourists have been erased from history, and that's a great shame, because they were groundbreakers. They were the first South Africans to tour, the first Africans to tour Britain. For many of the British sides that they played against, it was the first foreign opposition, and for many of these players, the first time they'd actually come in contact with black players. So they were groundbreakers. But because the South African War had broken out at this time, very little was reported in the South African press, because there was a war going on, and obviously a football tour is of no importance when we have people fighting and engaged in a war, as was the case in South Africa. The Corinthians, on the other hand, as I've said, toured in 1897, they toured in 1903, and they toured in 1907. When the South Africans were touring in 1899, it was actually a question of would they play against the Corinthians, and the Corinthians did not play against the tourists of 1899, and that was a great shame and a great opportunity that was actually lost. I think we can only speculate. We don't have any of Joseph Twayi's memoirs. We don't have anything of what he's actually written about the tour itself. As I said, I think there are two ways of looking at it, either as this exotic exhibition, but also as a group of young South Africans learning the game, going abroad, learning how to play football, and the organisers probably thought that they could make some money from this tour. And what a wonderful opportunity for a group of young South Africans to go to Britain to play football and to get paid. I think that Joseph was political before he went on tour, but I think his experience in Britain, where he got to meet with a number of dignitaries, a number of people, discussing the war amongst others, discussing equality more generally, I think that influenced his experience here. And this is where I think the role of agency is so important, that I would not look at the tour as this exotic exhibition. These were footballers who weren't very good, but were able to, in the end, play 50 games, had, I think, a wonderful experience as footballers, and brought these experiences back to South Africa. Yes, I think we must remember also that football at this time in South Africa was in no way of any similar standard to that in Britain, whether it was black or white football. Professional football was only introduced into South Africa in the 1950s, so these were all amateurs all along, and their level reflected that. Obviously, the South Africans played against all the major professional sides in Britain. So they played against, their first game was against Newcastle. They played against Sunderland. They played against Middlesbrough. They toured in Scotland. They played in the north of Ireland. They played in Wales. They played in France. And in all of the games that they played, they had fee-paying spectators, and the South Africans would take half of the gate revenues. The South Africans were put on in various cities and towns that they visited around the United Kingdom. They were entertained by the local dignitary, they were entertained by the mayor, they met a number of business personalities, a number of town folk. They had a number of smoking concerts in the evening where they would get together with the opposition, and they would have an orchestra, they would sing songs, they were treated as equals. And that's why, if we go back to the original point of what was the reason for the tour, one way of looking at it, as I've suggested, may have been seen as the exotic other, but from this this interaction with the local footballers and local dignitaries, they were treated as equals. So I think we need to reinterpret the tour. The South Africans played 50 games while on tour in Britain. They lost all of the games they played, bar 2 games. They played a game against Derby, they drew 6-all, and they played a team in France, in the city of Robois, and they beat them 3-1. We must remember that these were a group of South Africans, amateur footballers, many of them who had learned to play the game only in their early 20s, who were pitted against the premier opposition at that time. They played against Aston Villa, the champions from the previous season, played, as I said, Newcastle United, Tottenham, they played against Celtic, they played against a range of top British opposition, and I think they were originally pitted to be, or originally made out to be, this crack, superb South African side, which they weren't, I'm afraid. They were amateurs who were learning the game, and I think the opposition got to realise that they played in games where they conceded many goals. The most goals they conceded was 11 goals. They scored on a number of occasions. There were a few players that actually stood out as excellent players, and what we have, the goalkeeper, for example, who went by the name of Adolf. Adolf was one of the star players on tour, and we can imagine that would have been the case if he was playing in such a weak team. Towards the end of the tour, there was actually talk of trying to sign him on as a professional for some of the professional sides in the south of England. We don't know whatever happened to Adolf, and we don't know whether he did play professional football in Britain. But what it suggests is that some of the players were of a decent standard, but generally the team was playing against opposition that were far too strong for them. We must also remember that Britain at the time was the world leader in football, and when the South Africans went to France, they convincingly beat French opposition. So I think if the South Africans had been pitted against teams in Britain that were of an equal standard, they would have given this British opposition a run for their money. But I think it was unfair to expect the South Africans to beat the premier professional sides of the day. I think they were quite different. I think 1899 was a group of entrepreneurs who thought they could make money out of a group of black South Africans, bringing them over. We must remember in the late Victorian era, where there was still this notion of the exotic other. There was still this idea of black people being different from white people, and they were there on display. So I think they were very different from the tours which took place much later, which obviously had to do with African independence, and were very political, and of course treated people on an equal basis and equally.